Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is March 13th, 2016, and we've got a lot of topics to discuss on the show tonight. Now, before we do, I assume many of the listeners will know that last week we were not able to have a new broadcast due to logistical concerns, but we did broadcast the interview with David Icke, or at least the first hour of that interview, so hopefully you were able to catch that. Back this week with a new broadcast, and we're going to try to catch up on a number of different topics. But before we do, I'd like to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.tv. You can follow my work at activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, arrowofwisdom.com, and BrandonTurbeville.com. And if you're interested in my work specifically, and I highly encourage you to do this, that's follow BrandonTurbeville.com. And that's the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archives of this show, all of the interviews. Everything that I do is housed right there at BrandonTurbeville.com. So please go and check there. There's a lot of relevant information that's there. We've got an events page, the page for the radio show, page for the books, contact information. All that stuff is there. A link to the Twitter feed, so go and follow me on Twitter. There's a translate page there if you want to translate the articles into other languages. We encourage you to do that. Translate the articles into foreign languages and share them in that fashion as well. There's a free book on Hillary Clinton that's available there. I've got lots of links to other websites and stuff as well. So I don't think I've promoted the social media aspect ever since I've been doing this show, to be honest. But follow me on Twitter. Brandon Turb is my Twitter handle. Go follow me on Twitter. You can also find me on Facebook and add me there. So you can follow me on social media. But BrandonTurbeville.com is where you need to be in any event. So we're going to talk about a number of different topics tonight. We should mention the election campaign. Bernie Sanders, despite his best attempt to shoot as many holes in his boat as possible, managed to pull an upset win in Michigan. Yet, of course, they give more delegates and superdelegates to Hillary Clinton regardless. And this is ironically named the Democratic Party. So we were under no illusions about what was going to happen here from the very beginning. We've been in favor of sabotaging the Clinton campaign, certainly not a fan of Bernie Sanders at all. But the question here is how many states can Bernie win and still lose the nomination? Well, with the process of the Democratic Party, he could essentially win all of the states and still lose the nomination, or if not all, then virtually all. Still lose the nomination because of the invention of the superdelegate, which was created to prevent the actual democratic process from going forward. So that tells you if the Democratic Party can't even figure out democracy in its own party, what kind of hope does it have for the rest of the country? Well, it doesn't have any, as they've proven for the last 8 years, and then 8 years of Clinton. Must not have another Clinton administration in the White House. So more primaries coming up. I believe tomorrow is Ohio, so we'll be watching that, watching the Kasich campaigns, probably the final nail in the Kasich campaign. Then we'll have a three-man race in the Republican primary. It's really a two-man race, but they'll officially be three men in it. And with the Democrats, we are looking at a situation where it doesn't really matter what Bernie does anymore. A Bernie victory would provide us with the opportunity to suck a lot of Democrat supporters out of the Democratic Party, because a lot of people are going to be disenfranchised when they realize that their hero Bernie Sanders, and we're talking about genuine liberals here, their hero Bernie Sanders has won so many states, and they've exerted so much effort at getting this guy elected, and that he won a number of primaries. He was relatively successful despite himself, and yet the nomination process is already sewn up in the bag for Hillary Clinton. They're going to be very disenfranchised when they find out that all of their work was for naught and that the Democratic Party was always going to give this to Hillary and this was all a big charade. So this is going to give us an opportunity to pull a number of people out of the Democratic Party and hopefully utilize their political energy in a direction that we want to see that energy focused. With the Republican Party, you're going to see something else, right? With the Republicans, we have a situation where it could go a number of ways. And I've always maintained that the Donald Trump campaign is not separate from the Hillary Clinton campaign. And that has shocked and angered a lot of people because it's not something that most Trump supporters want to believe. I believe there's sufficient evidence for this. This guy was not a Republican. A couple of years ago, his positions on issues were not similar to his positions on issues today, although he has seemed to go back and forth in the last decade or so. Always been a close friend of the Clintons. The two groups, the Trumps and the Clintons, attended weddings back and forth and parties back and forth. There's been money exchanges between the two. He thought Hillary Clinton was the greatest Secretary of State ever. Now she's the worst. Nothing about the Donald Trump campaign screams that it's legitimate. But we're heading for a situation now where we are about to see one of two things that will result in a Hillary Clinton presidency. Well, one of three things. One is the possibility that Trump doesn't get the nomination for whatever reason, because of a Republican chicanery or because of simply losing the rest of the primaries, and he decides to run third party. If Trump runs third party, we're going to have a number of voters, Republican voters, who go out and vote for Trump, splitting the Republican voting base and providing us with a Hillary Clinton victory. On the other hand, we have a situation where Trump actually wins the nomination and either throws in the towel in some way, whether it becomes more inflammatory that even the average American can't put up with it, says more insulting things to different groups that it causes such an uproar that Hillary Clinton looks somewhat sane in comparison, if that's possible. There's also the opportunity that if he wins the nomination, that the Republican Party will stage a protest and run another candidate, maybe not even under the Republican Party since Trump gets the nomination, but under some other type of party name. They run a candidate like Marco Rubio or Mitt Romney or someone who's lesser known than those guys, but simply as a protest vote, which takes votes away from Trump, giving it to Hillary. And of course, the other option, that we have the brokered convention of the Republicans, where they go in and they have a backroom deal, where Trump wins the nominations, and democracy is speaking right now. If you're a Republican, your party is supporting Donald Trump, and Ted Cruz is a second, but he's not the winner. And there's no real question about this, that the Republican Party and the Republican base are supporting Trump. So the Republicans, in an effort to copy the Democrats, very well may go to the convention and say to themselves, we cannot put a clown like Donald Trump as the face of our party. Ted, Marco, step up. You're the nominee. And if that happens, what is going to be the result? Will Trump run third party? Will Republicans abandon the Republican candidate out of anger? Well, we know what would be the result. It would be a Hillary Clinton presidency. All of this stuff is lining up to be a major ringer for Hillary Clinton as she marches down the golden road to the White House that's been built straight for her to get there since years ago. This woman cannot be allowed to be president. We are mixing all of the negative elements from all the candidates into one bubbling cauldron of psychopathy, and this woman can barely hold back her psychopathy. It's clear just by looking at her. She's got the crazy eyes. If you ever want to look at her close up in a YouTube video, if you ever want to put yourself through that. Now, that's enough about the elections. Let's look at a bill that's coming to South Carolina. Don't necessarily expect it to pass, but it's H 4037 being examined in this congressional session. It's going to focus specifically on THC. We can see that the tide is beginning to turn in terms of public opinion on marijuana. Even here in South Carolina, there's a new push to legalize medical marijuana. And here in South Carolina, we're not exactly known for our reasonable drug laws, but even South Carolina now is being forced to admit that marijuana doesn't cause axe murders and terrorism, but it actually has a substantial amount of benefits. And we've got 3 state representatives sponsoring the legislation: Pierre McCoy, John King, and Jenny Horn. Jenny Horn said there are some medical uses for marijuana that would be beneficial not only for kids with epilepsy, but for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, fibromyalgia, terminal cancer. Other states have done this quite successfully, and we're looking at some of the other states who have done it well and kind of modeled the legislation off those other states, end quote. She pointed to the passage of a bill that legalized the use of CBD oil in 2014. We approve of that. That bill allowed the Medical University of South Carolina to conduct clinical trials using CBD oil. She says that H 4037 is going to bring similar opportunities to South Carolina regarding medical marijuana. Now, we're not confident that this bill is going to pass. It's probably not. But the fact that it's being submitted is a good thing, right? That shows that we're taking very small, tiny, minute steps in the right direction when it comes to the medical, or when it comes to the marijuana issue in South Carolina. Please, people, this is 2016. Can we please just legalize marijuana? Enough is enough. We've done prohibition enough. The panic should have subsided by now. The panic over marijuana. Who are these people that are terrified of pot? So we want to encourage everyone to contact their representatives, their state representatives in South Carolina. Unfortunately, here in South Carolina, we're kind of used to bills being submitted to the House that are genuinely good bills. They get passed by the House, and then they go to the Senate and die. We're used to that. There's all kinds of bills that have come through that would have made the state, a much better place, sort of a beacon of personal liberty. But they die in the Senate, and it makes headline news. It passed in the House, but it dies in the Senate. So we kind of expect that to happen with this bill. But with enough public support, perhaps we can push it on to the Senate, let it pass the House onto the Senate, and maybe put some pressure on some of the parasites in the state Senate. But the bill is H 4037, so if you can call your representatives, please do, and allow them to take a moment and listen to the facts regarding the marijuana issue. Now, we want to talk about the Middle East, of course. We've got serious issues taking place surrounding both Syria and Lebanon, and I want to talk about Syria first. Earlier at the beginning of the month, which I don't believe we were able to cover on any of the other shows this month, but we had an interview with Reuters with an aide to Saudi Arabia's defense minister, Brigadier General Ahmed Asseri, who confirmed that not only have the Saudis considered a direct military invasion of Syria, but that they've done so in collaboration and discussion with the other 49 nations making up this U.S.-led coalition against ISIS. Coalition against ISIS. A coalition against Syria, we'll call it. The aide confirmed in this interview the quote-unquote political discussion about the possibility of a ground troop deployment to Syria that was explored during the coalition ministerial meeting that took place in Brussels in February. Now, Asseri himself confirmed that the discussions took place. This is actually what he says directly. He says it was discussed 2 weeks ago in Brussels. It was on the political level as opposed to the detailed military mission. So this was not military planning, it was political planning. But he made a point to state that if the decision to invade is made, that Saudi Arabia would be ready and willing to contribute troops to the mission. He also admitted publicly that Saudi Arabia has been working on military plans for the potential invasion of Syria. He says, quote, once this is organized and decided how many troops and how they will go and where they will go, we will participate in that. We need to discuss at the military level very extensively with the military experts to make sure that we have a plan. End quote. The U.S. also confirmed the Saudi intentions with the U.S. State Department spokesman John Kirby, saying that the U.S. would welcome the cooperation of Saudi Arabia. This is, Kirby says, quote, but there's a lot that needs to be discussed in terms of what they would do, what their makeup would be, how they would need to be supported by the coalition going forward. So there's a lot of homework that needs to be done. So he's admitting that we are indeed discussing an invasion of Syria with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and a number of other countries taking part, 49 to be exact. Now, for its part, the Syrian government, via an official source at the Syrian Foreign and Expatriates Ministry, told the Sana news agency that Saudi Arabia is hurting any chances of peace in Syria, that's playing a destructive role in the process, threatening the security and the stability of the world. We agree. The source further argued that the UN Secretary General should immediately form a committee to examine the possibility of crimes that were committed and still being committed by the Saudi regime and in the Arab world. Sure. U.S. official then stated that the coalition will continue to provide arms and equipment to moderate terrorists in Syria despite the peace agreement. The official, this is what is quoted as saying, we will continue to provide equipment packages to vetted leaders and their units so that over time they can make a concerted push into territory still controlled. As a matter of policy, we won't comment or speculate on potential future operations. All right, well, nevertheless, the confirmation of the Saudi and U.S.-led coalition's intentions in the statements by the Saudis and the Americans come only a few weeks after a warning was issued by Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev of the potential for sparking a world war if peace negotiations were not conducted and relevant parties did not conduct themselves appropriately. Well, the ceasefire may have held on longer than we expected, but we know that relevant parties are not conducting themselves appropriately. That's fairly clear by the behavior of the Saudi Arabians and the United States. Now, I want to continue on this path into discussing Syria because I want to bring up the Caesar story, the Caesar reports. And this is going to be fairly detailed, but I want to go ahead and do this because I want to go ahead and put this propaganda foolishness to rest in regards to the Caesar report. Some of you may be familiar with it already because we've covered it. On January 20th, 2014, it was about 2 days before the negotiations were set to begin over Syria in Switzerland. And now, famous report was released that was claiming to hold photographic evidence of Assad's brutality against his own people and institutional torture programs that were in place by the Syrian government, etc. The report had one source. It was an alleged defector. He went by the name of Caesar. And these photos he allegedly took at a Syrian government military hospital. This was touted as evidence of Assad's cruelty and an example of how the Syrian president was committing war crimes that were, of course, reminiscent of Nazi Germany. The report just got plastered all across Western media, television screens, internet sites, perfect timing to disrupt any hope of a negotiated end to the Western-backed invasion of Syria at a time when the Syrian government was, of course, experiencing serious setbacks. Because remember, we only want ceasefires. The United States only wants ceasefires when the Assad government is winning. When they're losing, then there's no hope of peace. Ever since that report was released, those photos and the report statements have been repeatedly creeping back into the media spotlight at convenient times when massive propaganda blitzes against the Syrian government were being put in place, or when key decisions were being made regarding the future of Syria. In October of in October of 2014, I wrote an article called 7 Reasons to Doubt Latest Holocaust Claims Against Assad, and I outlined several discrepancies in the report, competing agendas regarding its release, other questionable aspects about the report, which I encourage people to go check out. All right, I'll run through them, and we'll cover them. We'll come back to them actually, because I want to get some more details out. So the first was that the Gulf state feudal monarchy of Qatar is the sponsor of one of the main reports and reviews of the photographs. The other is that the source of the report and photographs is questionable. Caesar himself is reminiscent of the famous curveball. Of course, number 4 is past claims of Assad's crimes against humanity. Number 5, possibility that the death squads could have killed the victims shown in the photographs, that the death squads are themselves the victims, or that the photographs contain a mix of the two. Number 6, the photographs were conveniently released just 2 days before the Geneva II Peace Conference meeting on Syria the first time. And number 7, involvement of color revolution NGOs. Now, you can go read those in my article. Again, I wrote this in October 2014. 7 Reasons to Doubt Latest Holocaust Claims Against Assad. I highly encourage you to go read that article and take a look, but we're gonna go in depth a little more. Those 7 reasons alone were enough to doubt the veracity of the report and the claims that it made, as well as suspect that the report is nothing more than a carefully crafted hoax designed to act as a propaganda push against the legitimate Syrian government. But we've got another report, a counter report, written by Rick Sterling of Syria Solidarity Movement, and the report is entitled "The Caesar Photo Fraud That Undermined Syrian Negotiations: 12 Problems with the Story of Mass Torture and Execution in Syria." This is a 30-page report by Rick Sterling, and over those 30 pages, he provides a detailed deconstruction of the Caesar photos, and he's got 12 points here. I'm not going to list them. We'll actually go through some of them. He wrote an article to go along with that report, and it's the same name. In other words, it's the Caesar Photo Fraud That Undermined Syrian Negotiations, which you can find at Information Clearinghouse, Syrian Perspective, a couple of other places as well. And he confirms the suspicions that I put forward in 2014. So he confirms it. He demonstrates that the report is constructed for the purpose of blaming the Syrian government for something it did not do. So we encourage you to go look at that report and share it far and wide. Now, let's start going into this, the original Caesar report, so we can go ahead and put this propaganda effort to bed, right? The Carter-Ruck Inquiry Team. And the Carter-Ruck Inquiry Team, this was the evaluation of the Caesar story that was conducted by the Carter-Ruck law firm. Carter-Ruck was on contract to Qatar, so we cannot forget the fact that Qatar paid this law firm to analyze the report and the photos provided by this alleged defector, Caesar. So the Carter-Ruck Inquiry Team claimed there were about 55,000 photos total, with about half of them taken by Caesar and the other half taken by other photographers. The Carter-Ruck team claimed that the photos were all similar, right? Together, that they all are known as the Caesar torture photos. All the photos are similar, they say. So the photographs themselves are in the custody of what else could we call it? Opposition organization, pro-terrorist organization, pro-NATO organization, anti-Assad organization. So definitely partisan. It's called the Syrian Association for Missing and Conscience Detainees, SAFMCD. And in 2015, they allowed Human Rights Watch to study all the photographs which otherwise have been secret. And in December of 2015, Human Rights Watch released a report titled, "If the Dead Could Speak." And the biggest revelation here, despite the fact that Human Rights Watch is attempting to promote the case for humanitarian bombing, their biggest revelation is that over 46% of the photographs, so 24,568 photographs, do not show people tortured to death by the Syrian government. On the contrary, they show the dead Syrian soldiers, victims of car bombs and other violence. So nearly half of the photos show the opposite of what was alleged. These photos never were revealed to the public. It confirmed that the opposition is violent, that they've killed large numbers of security forces, and that they've killed large numbers of civilians. But nowhere was that mentioned in the Western reports regarding the Caesar photos. So we also got to look at this. The Carter-Ruck report says that Caesar only photographed bodies brought from the Syrian government detention centers. Okay, so in their December 2015 report, Human Rights Watch said this: the largest category of photographs, 28,707 images, are photographs Human Rights Watch understands to have died in government custody, either in one of several detention facilities or after being transferred to a military hospital, end quote. They estimate 6,786 dead individuals in the set. Now, the photos and the deceased people there are real, but how they died and the circumstances under which they died are unclear. There is strong evidence that some of them died in conflict. Others died in the hospital. Others clearly died and their bodies were decomposing before they were picked up. So these photographs seem to document a wartime situation where many combatants, many civilians are killed. It seems the military hospital was doing basically what it had always done, which was maintaining a photographic and documentary record of the deceased. Bodies were being picked up by different military or intelligence branches. Well, some may have died in detention. The big majority probably died in conflict zones, and that's confirmed by Rick Sterling's report that the majority of them probably died in conflict zones. The accusations by Caesar and by Carter-Ruck and Human Rights Watch that all these victims are victims of death in detention or death by torture or death in government custody, that's almost certainly false. That's just not true. Many of these photos were manipulated also by using duplicate photos, editing in information, and case numbers, etc. Many of the photos at the SAFMCD website have been manipulated, right? The information card and tape identity are covered over and sections of documents are obscured. It must have been very time consuming to do this for all these thousands of photos, but the explanation that they are doing this to protect identity, that's not credible because they are showing photographs of victims, right, and their faces. So all that's visible, so what are they hiding? There's a number of errors and anomalies in the photo catalog as presented at the SAFMCD website. For example, some dead people there are shown twice with different case numbers and dates. There's other errors where different individuals are given the same identity number. Adam Larson, at a closer look at Syria, it's a website there, he's a researcher, he's done detailed investigation which reveals more errors and curious error patterns in the photo catalog provided by the SAFMCD. Now, the inquiry claims basically that simple administrative duties should be classified as horrific war crimes in this report. So the Carter-Ruck inquiry team falsely claimed there were about 11,000 tortured and killed detainees. Then they posed the question, why would the Syrian government photograph and document the people they just killed? Well, the Carter-Ruck report speculates that the military hospital photographed the dead people to provide the evidence that the orders to kill had been followed. And the orders to kill are assumed. This is something that it has to be pointed out, right? This is circular logic. Well, how do we know that they photographed them because they were trying to prove the orders to kill? Well, because the orders to kill happened to begin with. But that's a presupposition which there is no evidence for. So if you believe that there were orders to kill, then maybe it makes sense. But the orders to kill are not that's not proven in any way. In fact, the photographic evidence shows the opposite. So a more logical example is that the dead bodies were photographed as part of a normal hospital or morgue procedure to maintain a file on the deceased who were received or treated at the hospital. This is basic procedure, especially in wartime. You take a photograph, maintain a file, give it a case number, put it away. So the same applies to the body labeling and body numbering system. Right? The Carter-Ruck report suggests that this is some kind of mysterious and possibly sinister coded tagging system like the Hitler Nazi Germany experimentation program. But I do believe that all morgues need to have a tagging and identification system, so I don't see what's so concerning about that. Now, the victims in the report, some of them have been abused and starved, but before jumping to conclusions about just how these people died, it's necessary to look back at the context of the victims, right? After all, the death squads, the moderate terrorists operating in Syria are no strangers to crimes against humanity. They're no strangers to murder or torture or starvation. In fact, they've been both the initiators of that and overwhelmingly the largest proprietors of it. In fact, there's no evidence that the Syrian military has ever done any of that intentionally, or at least not the civilians. So the fact that the victims were starved does not necessarily mean that they were starved by the government. It's important to remember that due to the siege of a number of cities by both the military and the terrorists, as well as due to the terrorist cruelty, right, the moderate rebel cruelty, and the attempted cordoning off of specific areas and all of that, food shortage has been a serious concern in many areas for some time. There's plenty of evidence that the terrorist groups killing innocent people and shipping their bodies to the places where cameras are set up, waiting for the recording of the propaganda piece. We know that they do this, right? The Ghouta chemical attack is just one instance in which innocent civilians were captured and killed by the death squads and used as stage props for propaganda purposes. So we got to remember also that the terrorists themselves are quite adept at keeping prisoners in atrocious conditions. We did a report some time ago about the Syrian military being able to free a number of captive Syrian women from the hands of the moderate terrorists that Barack Obama and John Kirby and Hillary Clinton love to support, and Bernie Sanders, who had kept these women in captivity in underground tunnels for months on end for the purposes of using them as sex slaves. But we know, for instance, that the moderate terrorists will not only murder, rape, torture, starve people, but they'll use them. They'll do all of those things to use them simply for propaganda purposes. We also need to mention, though, the identity of Caesar. Who is this guy, Caesar? The Carter-Ruck report, this is what it has to say. The witness who defected from Syria and who had been working for the Syrian government was given the code name Caesar by the inquiry team to protect the witness and members of his family. End quote. So if this story is true, if Caesar's story is true, rather, it would be relatively easy for the Syrian government to determine who he really is, right? After all, how many military photographers took photos at Tishreen and Military 601 hospitals during those years and then disappeared suddenly? According to the Carter-Ruck report, Caesar's family had left Syria around the same time. So if his identity is so easily known, determined, basically by what I just said, by looking at who took pictures and then disappeared, and if his family is out of Syria, what's the big deal? What's the big concern, right? Why does he need to keep his identity secret from the Western audience? Why does he refuse to meet even with the highly sympathetic journalists or researchers who are falling over themselves to back up his claims. The fact that 46% of the total photographic set is substantially the opposite of what was claimed indicates two things. That Caesar and his promoters knew the contents but lied about them, expecting nobody to look, or Caesar and his promoters didn't know about the contents and just assumed they were like the others. I don't think that that's the case. I believe that this is more carefully constructed propaganda that that they knew the contents, but they expected nobody to really look. That they essentially padded these photographs because they expected very few researchers to get around to this, to really dig into it. And the average American, see, propaganda is designed for the average American. The few of us can sift through it is not a great concern, so long as we're not able to communicate that to the average American on a mass scale. So they pad these photographs, and then they can promote the photographs as being, 50,000, 55,000 photographs there, and nobody's going to really question that now that it's out in the mainstream media. So we got to look at who this Caesar is, right? Who is he working for? See, if he's part of this propaganda narrative, who is he? He's not just a volunteer. He's got to be somebody relatively important. This is where it gets interesting, right? In an interview with France 24, Professor David Crane, who was a part of the Carter-Ruck inquiry, stated that Caesar was brought to meet them, meaning the Carter-Ruck inquiry, by his handler, his case officer. That's a direct quote. Now, the expression case officer usually refers to the CIA, does it not? This would be a common expression for Professor Crane, who did indeed previously work in the Defense Intelligence Agency. The involvement of the CIA makes additional sense, since there was a CIA budget of $1 billion for Syria operations in 2013 that we know of. That's not even the Black Project. Professor Crane also has, David Crane, has the Syria Accountability Project, which is based at Syracuse University, where the CIA actively recruits new officers despite resistance by a number of the student body there. So why does it matter if the CIA is connected to the Caesar story? Well, listeners to this show should know, but because the CIA has had a long history of disinformation campaigns. Remember, 2011, false reports, Viagra-fueled rape by Libyan soldiers, widely broadcast in the Western media as the United States pushed for a military mandate, which they went into Libya, which they got, destroyed the country, killed Gaddafi. Now it is in the Stone Age. Decades earlier, remember, the world was shocked to hear about Cuban troops in Angola raping Angolan women. CIA Chief of Station Chief John Stockwell later remembered how they invented the false report, spread it around the world. They're pretty proud of that now. Stockwell has a book, actually, called In Search of Enemies, where he discussed all that. So, this Carter-Ruck inquiry itself is conflict of interest it's conflict of interest galore, right? It's fraught with telltale signs of carefully constructed propaganda. The law firm conducting the inquiry was contracted by Qatar. This is the GCC member, which was assisting in the funding of al-Qaeda terrorists and the destruction of Syria to begin with. And it also represented Turkey's President Erdogan in the past, right? It's another major player in the war against Syria. Carter-Ruck inquiry is a hoax. I'm sorry, it's a hoax. It's a paid propaganda effort. Now put that together with the apparent intentionally shoddy research conducted by the Carter-Ruck team, Crane's ties to the U.S. intelligence community, and the involvement of Color Revolution NGOs, which I hope I get to mention. The Caesar story doesn't add up. Before I go through a list of some of these things, let me just bring up the color revolution NGOs. That was the one thing that Mr. Sterling didn't cover. I don't think. I'll have to go back and look over his report. But I highly encourage you to read his report. Caesar's entire trip to the United States had been organized and facilitated by the Coalition for a Democratic Syria. That's an organization that has very close ties to the National Democratic Institute, the NDI, which is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, both groups being a notorious color revolution operations, right? Remember the NDI website. This is a quote. NDI works with a number of established political parties and emerging movements on party development and organizational structure. The Institute's partners include the Damascus Declaration, the People's Party, Building the Syrian State, the Kurdish Youth Tansikiyat Union, the Ahrar Party, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Democratic Platform, the National Change Trend, the Syrian Democratic Coalition, and Yakiti Party. So the Syrian Democratic Coalition contains a number of pictures of Syria with the green, white, and black flag of the moderate terrorists and their the so-called moderate terrorists, instead of the real flag, right, which is the red, white, and black flag of the Syrian government. There's no green except in the stars. The NDI website admits funding terrorists in Syria, but they do it in couched terms. They say, quote, NDI has built long-term partnerships with Syrian organizations since 2005, working with more than 1,200 Syrian Democrats and an extensive network of civil society leaders and opposition activists. Through 2010, NDI assisted a Damascus-based civil society organization and resource center at Tana Press in assessing the needs of civil society in Syria and building resources and knowledge to meet those needs. Since the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011, NDI has intensified its assistance to opposition activists seeking democratic reform. Couched terms, because we all know what this crap means, right? Democratic reform, opposition activists. We know that you're funding terrorists, NDI. So all that information there is readily available on the websites, and you can go see it in my article. Now, just to kind of sum it up, the credibility of the Caesar story has been substantially based on the Carter-Ruck inquiry team that we've been talking about, which allegedly verified the defecting photographer and his photographs. Now, the Carter-Ruck team itself obviously biased with a political motive. The investigation, as I mentioned, was financed by the government of Qatar, which is a major supporter of the moderate terrorists and the not-so-moderate terrorists. The contracted law firm, Carter-Ruck and Company, was previously, or has previously, represented Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, also known for his support of the moderate terrorists and the not-so-moderate terrorists. The American on the legal inquiry team, that's Professor David M. Crane, that we've discussed, has a long history of working for the U.S. Department of Defense and the Defense Intelligence Agency. U.S. government deeply involved in the attempt at regime change, always screaming Assad must go since 2011, and still essentially calling for Assad to go. Crane is personally partisan in the conflict. He's campaigned for a Syria War Crimes Tribunal, testified before Congress in October 2013, 3 months before the Caesar revelations. By their own admission, the inquiry team was under quote-unquote time constraints. By their own admission, the inquiry team did not even survey most of the photographs. We also have the inquiry team either ignorant of the content or intentionally lying about the 46% of the photographs showing dead Syrian soldiers and civilians, terrorist attack victims, not victims of the Syrian government, because the Syrian government doesn't do suicide bombings. We also have the inquiry team doing their last interview with Caesar on January 18th, quickly finalizing a report and then rushing it into the media on January 20th. 2 days prior to the start of the UN-sponsored negotiations, and all that occurred within 2 days. These things usually take more time. They're usually more gradual. So the self-proclaimed rigor of the Carter-Ruck investigation is a joke. There's no foundation to it at all. The claims to be a scientific investigation are without substance, and as Rick Sterling says in his article, verging on the ludicrous. Now, a word on Human Rights Watch, since that's going to get the attention of many people who are rightly concerned about human rights across the world, but who unfortunately give credence to Human Rights Watch. Remember, on February 25th, Human Rights Watch posted a photo of a devastated civilian area in Syria with the tagline, "Syria dropped barrel bombs despite ban." Well, that ban that Human Rights Watch is referring to is the ban on bombing civilian areas that applies to both sides in Aleppo after the United Nations stepped in to save the Western-backed moderate terrorists from annihilation. Assad's forces had surrounded the city largely and had cut off a major supply route for the terrorists from Turkey, and that made the ultimate elimination of the jihadists a virtual inevitability. So we had Human Rights Watch saying that the government had dropped so-called barrel bombs on hundreds of sites in rebel-held towns and cities in the past year. That's what a report, for instance, by Somini Sengupta wrote for the New York Times. Why don't I do this? I want to read just a couple sentences here from that article in the New York Times. Somini Sengupta. Quote, Human Rights Watch said Tuesday that the Syrian government had dropped so-called barrel bombs on hundreds of sites in rebel-held towns and cities in the past year, flouting a United Nations Security Council measure. In a report released Tuesday, the group said it relied on satellite images, photos, videos, and witness statements to conclude that the Syrian government have bombarded at least 450 sites in and around the southern town of Dara and at least 1,000 sites in Aleppo in the north. The report focused on the period since February 22, 2014, when the Security Council specifically condemned the use of barrel bombs, which are large containers filled with explosives and projectiles that can indiscriminately hurt civilians and are prohibited under international law, end quote. I did that because I wanted you to see the type of reports that were coming out of the mainstream media. Right, how these reports and claims and these photographs, for instance, that said Syria dropped barrel bombs despite ban on February 25th by Human Rights Watch, how they were reported in the mainstream media. So you get the idea of how many people would be looking at this garbage. Human Rights Watch is generally followed by well-meaning liberals and people who are kind of generally concerned with human rights. Not questioned, they're held to on a pedestal essentially. So the questioning in Human Rights Watch is generally pretty low. The New York Times, of course, one of the major media outlets. All of this information is stated by the Western media. Human Rights Watch isn't questioned, and thus this becomes the narrative. But see, there's a problem with Human Rights Watch's tweet, right? The photograph that they provided was not Aleppo. In fact, the damage that had been produced on the civilian area in the photograph was not committed by the Syrian military. It was committed by the United States. But it's because the photo was actually a picture of Kobane, or Ain al-Arab. It's the city where the U.S. had been bombing heavily over the last several months prior to that photograph, as they engaged the program, I guess we call it here on this show, the Death Squad herding, right? That's where they use bombing and military action to push the death squads and the terrorists into other locations. And of course, geographical reformation of the sovereign Syrian and Iraqi territory, as they had a major battle between the Kurds and ISIS there. The U.S. had been bombing Ain al-Arab, Kobane, for some time, and this is the photograph that Human Rights Watch posted up and claimed it was Aleppo. It was not Aleppo. It was Kobane. It was Ain al-Arab. Human Rights Watch was content, of course, to use the destruction of this city as a reason to condemn the Assad government and continue to promote the cause for U.S. military action in Syria. The Human Rights Organization, not interested in the exact same destruction wrought by U.S. forces. So if Assad's forces bomb a quote-unquote civilian area into the Stone Age, it's an atrocity. It's a war crime. It's justification for international military involvement, humanitarian bombing, all of that kind of stuff. Responsibility to protect, all of this stuff that got us into Libya. If the United States bombs a civilian area into the Stone Age, it's no biggie. No problem. Let's just move on. Now, the areas that Assad's bombing aren't generally civilian areas. These are, even by admissions, by many of these human rights organizations, rebel-held cities, which, contrary to the narrative that's promoted in the Western media, whenever the terrorists, the moderate rebels, take over an area, the civilians usually flee en masse, because despite the fact that Americans may be comfortable with monkeys walking around with disgusting, dirty, lice-infested beards, raping and beheading their way across a city and imposing Sharia law and the Stone Age upon the civilized people that lived there, the Syrians generally aren't content to live under that, and they flee en masse to government-held areas because that's where they feel safe. That is their culture, the secular culture there of Syria, the modern culture of Syria that's being destroyed by the West. So, Human Rights Watch. I want to keep mentioning Human Rights Watch for a minute in the time that we have left. I want to wrap up. We'll get to Lebanon next week. Human Rights Watch has repeatedly shielded for NATO and the West's imperialist agenda, particularly in Syria. Remember, Human Rights Watch is partially funded by George Soros. That's important to know as well. When the Western media propaganda had reached a crescendo regarding the outright lie that Assad had used chemical weapons against his own people, remember that it was Human Rights Watch that stood right beside Barry Soetoro, Barack Obama, and John Kerry in their effort to prove Assad's guilt. Human Rights Watch even went so far as to repeat the lie that the United Nations report suggested that Assad was the offending party. It did not in any way do that. So that should have driven the final nail into the coffin of any credibility that Human Rights Watch may have had. When the Russians stepped in for this last-minute chemical weapons deal, right as the United States was poised to do what they've wanted to do for a long time, which was just invade Syria, Human Rights Watch didn't come out and rejoice over the opportunity to have a peaceful destruction of chemical weapons and a chance to avoid a catastrophic war. It actually came out and attacked the deal by claiming that it failed to ensure justice. Well, it did fail to ensure justice because there's no provisions demanding the punishment of the moderate terrorists who actually used the weapons. There was no provisions to ensure justice against the United States or NATO that initiated and controlled the jihadist invasion to begin with. So, in that sense, it's true. And remember also, Mother Agnes Miriam of the Cross, when she released her report that refuted what the U.S. and NATO war machine was asserting in regards to chemical weapons in Syria, Human Rights Watch didn't look at that information and investigate it and share it out. They actually embarked upon a campaign of attack and ridicule and slander against her and her work. Human Rights Watch, of course, is the human rights organization that showed its true colors by signing off on renditions. 2009, they supported renditions, the process of kidnapping people off the street without any due process and rendering them to jails and prisons in other countries where they're tortured. Secret talks with the Obama administration and Human Rights Watch, they signed off on it. They had any credibility in terms of the questions of human rights, then all of that has been lost. Human Rights Watch is nothing but a pro-U.S., pro-NATO NGO that acts like a smokescreen for the continuation of the violation of human rights across the world. That, of course, unless those violations are committed by America's enemies, and then they're all on that. Now, we've spent a great deal of time on that. Again, we don't have time to go into the situation in Lebanon. We'll try to cover that next week. I also want to mention some things about the CDC next week. We actually have reports. Well, not really a report. We've got the discovery of the PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Glenn Nowak, who was acting director of the media relations for the CDC and associate director for the communications for the NIP and CDC. That is a PowerPoint presentation that's an attempt to promote the flu vaccine, and the presentation looks more like something like Edward Bernays or Zbigniew Brzezinski, an aggressive corporate marketing firm, than anything related to public health. This is supposed to be a short talk about how to best encourage the public to accept vaccinations and encourage vaccine uptake, but the presentation's a list and chronological display of how to manipulate statistics and take advantage of mass media, create mass hysteria, capitalize on a witless, frightened public to achieve the aims of the CDC. And I don't have time to go into that tonight either, but that's up naturalblaze.com and brandonturbeville.com. CDC docs reveal deceptive media campaign to instill fear, anxiety to push flu vaccine. You can find that at naturalblaze.com and brandonturbeville.com. We've only got limited time left here. Also, BrandonTurbeville.com. Go look at the article, When It's Time to Report on Their Crimes, Turkey, Saudi, Israel, See Time to Crack Down, by Afra Dagher. It's there. She is reporting the Israeli forces raided Palestinian television station Palestine Today and arrested Farouk Aliyat, the manager there, on March 11th, 2016. And she points out how Israel would like to silence Palestine Today, and it's attempting to do so by accusing it of backing the Islamic Jihadi militia against the Zionist occupation forces. She points out how ironic that is, since Israel offers terrorists and jihadists operating in Syria and labeled moderate rebels every possible form of support, including medical treatment in Israeli hospitals and ambulances on the border. She points out the hypocrisy of that policy. So that's at BrandonTurbeville.com. Encourage you to check that out. We're going to have a lot of big things coming up in the near future, ladies and gentlemen. Please stick with us. Keep tuning in. Keep tuning in at Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be checking BrandonTurbeville.com on a daily basis. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
JJ Inc. from Against the Wall, and you're listening to UCY